History has a strange habit of disguising its most important moments. When we look back, everything feels obvious: the causes, the consequences, the warning signs. But for the people living through it, the present rarely feels historic. It feels normal, manageable, temporary. This chapter begins in a world that believed it had time. At the surface, things appeared stable. Institutions were functioning. Leaders were speaking confidently, and everyday life continued with familiar routines. Markets opened and closed. Newspapers printed reassuring headlines. Speeches were delivered with carefully chosen words meant to calm, not alarm. And most people, understandably, trusted that someone somewhere was in control. But beneath that calm surface, pressure was building. Historians now agree that this period was defined by misjudgment, not ignorance, but a dangerous kind of confidence. Decision-makers didn't lack information, they lacked urgency. Each warning was interpreted as exaggerated. Each troubling sign was labeled temporary, and each delay felt harmless until delays became habits. Here's the uncomfortable truth. History didn't suddenly change. It drifted, slowly enough that few noticed. Why didn't people react sooner? Part of the answer lies in human psychology. When change comes gradually, it feels less threatening. Small shifts don't trigger panic. They trigger adjustment. People adapt. Leaders compromise. Systems bend instead of breaking. And every time the system bends without snapping, it convinces everyone that it always will. Another reason is fragmentation. No single event seemed large enough to demand action on its own. Each issue was handled separately, passed between committees, departments, or governments. Responsibility became diluted. When everyone is partially responsible, no one feels fully accountable. And then there was optimism, not the hopeful kind, but the assumptive kind. The belief that because disaster hadn't happened yet, it probably wouldn't. After all, similar situations in the past had resolved themselves. Why would this be any different? That assumption would prove costly. What makes this moment so haunting is not what happened, but what didn't. No dramatic collapse, no immediate catastrophe. Just a series of quiet choices that slowly narrowed the range of possible futures. Looking back, historians often point to this phase as the last window where outcomes were still flexible, where intervention could have altered the course, where hesitation still mattered. But at the time, it felt like just another chapter in an ongoing story. This is the moment history looked away, not because it was blind, but because it believed it could look back later. In the next chapter, we'll go deeper. Long before this moment arrived, forces were already moving beneath the surface, shaping what was to come, often years, even decades earlier. By the time history appeared to hesitate, the ground beneath it had already shifted. Major events rarely emerge out of nowhere. They grow quietly, layered over time, fed by decisions so ordinary. They barely register as history in the making. To understand how things reached that fragile moment, we have to look backward, not years, but often decades. The earliest roots formed during a period of expansion and confidence. Economies were growing. Political systems were consolidating power. And technological progress created the illusion that humanity had finally learned how to manage large-scale complexity. With every success came reinforcement of the same belief: this system works. But systems don't fail all at once. They erode. Small compromises were made in the name of efficiency. Short-term gains were prioritized over long-term stability. Regulations were loosened, safeguards delayed, and uncomfortable questions postponed for a more convenient time. Each choice seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern. One of the most overlooked factors was incentive misalignment. Those making key decisions were often rewarded for growth, speed, or visibility, not caution. Slowing things down carried political or economic costs. Warning others risked being labeled alarmist, and so silence or soft language became the safer option. Meanwhile, inequality began to widen, not always in obvious ways. Access to resources, influence, and protection slowly concentrated upward. For those at the top, risks felt abstract. For those below, they felt real, but distant from power. This gap mattered. It shaped who was heard and who wasn't when early concerns were raised. There was also the issue of complexity. As systems grew larger, they became harder to fully understand. No single individual could see the whole picture anymore. Decisions were made within narrow fields of expertise, while broader consequences remained unseen when problems emerged. They were often misdiagnosed, treated as technical glitches instead of structural weaknesses. And then came normalization. Each minor failure reset expectations. What once seemed unacceptable slowly became tolerable. Standards shifted downward, not because people wanted them to, but because adaptation felt easier than resistance. This process happened quietly, without public debate or dramatic moments. By the time warning signs became visible to outsiders, insiders had already grown used to them. Historians sometimes describe this stage as the long calm before recognition, not because nothing was happening, but because everything important was happening out of sight. Looking back, the signs are painfully clear, but clarity is a luxury of hindsight. At the time, these routes didn't look dangerous. They looked like progress, modernization, and pragmatism. Yet once roots grow deep enough, they shape everything above them. In the next chapter, we'll examine how these underlying forces collided with ambition and pressure, and how power, once set in motion, begins to resist slowing down. Once the roots were in place, momentum took over. Power has a gravitational pull. The more of it you hold, the harder it becomes to change direction, not because you can't, but because too many forces depend on you continuing forward by this stage. Decisions were no longer just about what was right or wrong. They were about preserving authority, credibility, and control. Leaders faced pressure from every angle. Political pressure to appear decisive, economic pressure to maintain growth, social pressure to project confidence. Admitting uncertainty was seen as weakness. Slowing down felt like failure, and reversing course, that was almost unthinkable. Ambition played a quiet but decisive role, not always personal ambition, often institutional ambition. Organizations wanted influence, governments wanted relevance, Systems wanted expansion. And when ambition aligns with momentum, it creates a powerful current that's difficult to swim against. Here's where things get complicated. Even when concerns reached the top, they were filtered, language softened, risks were reframed, worst-case scenarios were moved to the footnotes. Not because anyone was deliberately hiding the truth, but because the truth was inconvenient. It disrupted plans. It raised questions no one had good answers for. And there was another factor: competition. No one wanted to be the first to hesitate. If one actor slowed down while others pressed forward, the fear was simple: you'd lose ground, influence, advantage. In that environment, caution felt like surrender. So everyone kept moving, reassured by the fact that everyone else was doing the same. This created an echo chamber. Confidence fed confidence. Success reinforced belief. And warning voices, when they appeared, sounded increasingly out of place, like someone whispering in a crowded room. Power also changes perspective. From the center, problems appear smaller. Distance dulls urgency. What feels immediate and threatening on the ground can seem theoretical. From above, reports become numbers, trends become charts, and human consequences turn into abstractions. That distance mattered. Because while leaders debated language and timing, reality was already adjusting to their decisions. Systems were locking in. Dependencies were forming, and options were quietly disappearing. What makes this phase so critical is that it still felt reversible. Many believed there would be time to correct course later, once more data arrived, once conditions stabilized, once the next milestone was reached. But momentum doesn't wait. By the time hesitation finally seemed necessary, the cost of stopping had grown far higher than the cost of continuing. And when that happens, people rarely choose disruption over familiarity. In the next chapter, we'll focus on the moments that could have changed everything: the warnings, the signals, and the voices that tried to break through, and why they failed to do so. Every major turning point in history leaves behind a trail of ignored warnings, not because they didn't exist, but because they didn't arrive loudly enough, clearly enough, or from the right people. By this stage, the signals were there. Reports flagged inconsistencies. Analysts noticed patterns. That didn't quite add up. On the ground, those closest to the situation felt unease long before it appeared in official briefings. Something wasn't working the way it was supposed to. But warnings are fragile things. Many arrived fragmented, spread across departments, institutions, or regions. No single alert captured the full picture. One report suggested strain, another hinted at instability, a third raised concerns but stopped short of firm conclusions. Each warning, on its own, felt manageable. Together, they formed a message that was never fully assembled. There was also a credibility problem. Warnings don't carry equal weight. Those delivered by insiders were often softened to avoid backlash. Those coming from outsiders were easier to dismiss. Critics were labeled pessimists. Experts were accused of exaggeration. And in some cases, warnings were inconveniently timed, clashing with major initiatives, political cycles, or economic goals. So they were postponed. We'll revisit this later. Let's wait for more data. Now isn't the right moment. Sound familiar? Another obstacle was language. Early warnings rarely sound dramatic. They're cautious by nature, filled with probabilities, margins of error, and conditional phrasing. Ironically, the more honest and careful the warning, the easier it is to ignore. Humans respond to certainty, not nuance. And then there was fatigue. After hearing concerns repeatedly, without immediate consequences, people grew numb. Each non-event reinforced the belief that things would continue to hold. Over time, warnings lost their emotional impact. They became background noise. What is especially tragic is that some of these warnings did reach decision-makers and were even acknowledged. But acknowledgement isn't action. Recognizing a risk doesn't mean prioritizing it. And when attention is divided among dozens of competing pressures, the future often loses to the present. History shows us something uncomfortable here. Societies are often warned not once, but many times. Failure doesn't come from silence. It comes from hesitation. By the time warnings finally became impossible to ignore, they no longer functioned as warnings. They became confirmations, proof that the feared outcome was already underway. And that's the cruel paradox. The clearer the danger became, the fewer options remained. In the next chapter, we'll arrive at the exact moment when the balance tipped, the point after which events were no longer just developing, they were unfolding. There is always a moment, not loud, not cinematic, when possibility narrows. The turning point didn't arrive as a single decision or dramatic announcement. It arrived as a threshold, crossed almost without noticing. One more compromise, one more delay. One more assumption that tomorrow would offer better options than today. It didn't. By now, the system had shifted from prevention to management. Instead of asking, how do we stop this? The question quietly became, how do we live with it? That change in framing mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because once you begin managing a problem, you've already accepted its existence. This moment was defined by lock-in. Commitments had been made, resources invested, reputations tied to outcomes. Reversing course would have required not just technical adjustments, but public admission of miscalculation. And for institutions built on authority, that kind of admission carries weight. Too much weight. As it turned out, from the outside, the shift was almost invisible. Life continued. Official language remained calm. Headlines avoided urgency. But internally, conversations changed. Contingency plans replaced long-term visions. Risk assessments became more frequent and more troubling. Those closest to the data could feel it. The margin for error was shrinking. At this stage, reactions were still possible, but they came with costs: political backlash, economic disruption, social uncertainty. Every option involved sacrifice, and no one wanted to be responsible for choosing pain now over potential pain later. So delay won again, and delay has consequences. Each passing moment reinforced the new reality. Systems adapted around the problem instead of removing it. Temporary solutions became semi-permanent. Emergency measures quietly normalized. What once would have triggered alarm now triggered procedure. This is where history often hardens. Because once a structure is built to accommodate risk, removing that risk threatens the structure itself. The solution becomes dependent on the problem. It was meant to solve. By the time the turning point was recognized for what it was, the language had changed. No one spoke about it anymore, only when and how severe. That realization didn't spread evenly. Some understood immediately, others resisted, clinging to earlier assumptions. And many never noticed the shift at all until the effects reached them directly. What makes this moment so haunting isn't that action was impossible, it's that action felt unacceptable. And that distinction matters. In the next chapter, we'll see what happened when responses finally came, why they felt urgent, why they felt chaotic, and why, in many cases, they arrived far too late.